We're going to now, as Kathy provided an excellent segue on corporate capture, none of these things can be solved as well as they could be if the very companies that we're kind of up against are also insinuated into governments and actually the ones in charge of making policy or directing policy or influencing policy in a way that's dramatically outsized for what it should be. And so I'm going to kick it over to my colleague Nicole, who's going to be leading us through a conversation with some wonderful panelists on corporate capture and the ways in which companies have put themselves into decision-making roles within government or influence government, and how we can be thinking through resolving and correcting for that kind of critical and foundational power imbalance, so that for all the issues that we're discussing here, whether it be the environmental crisis and catastrophe, the labor rights needs that we're facing, or the racial justice movement that we need to get correct, all of that is affected by how governments are influenced and who controls power. And so with that, I will hand it over to my colleague Nicole.
Great, thank you, David. And thank you everyone for joining for the second session of the day, and thanks to Kathy for the wonderful transition and setup for this session. I'm Nicole Vandermeulen, Senior Advocacy Counsel at ICAR, and I have the pleasure of moderating this session on corporate capture. So broadly speaking, as David sort of touched on, corporate capture really refers to the phenomenon of private industry using both its economic and political power to exert significant influence over or even take control of public institutions such as legislative bodies, regulatory agencies, and even courts. And as most of you are aware, there's a wide variety of ways that corporations capture these institutions, including direct lobbying, use of the revolving door, and through funding political parties and candidates, among others. And of course, by capturing these key state bodies, industries are essentially able to control the rules under which they function, allowing them to evade accountability and really manipulate the state into putting corporate interests and profits ahead of the common good. And I'm sure, as most of you know or have even experienced in your work, this is a significant barrier to positive change. And as David said and was mentioned in the previous panel, really leads to laws and policies that harm the environment, undermine human rights, and that harm vulnerable communities within society. So during today's panel, we're going to be exploring some of the key methods of capture. We'll be looking at corporate capture from a racial justice lens. We'll be exploring efforts to combat capture both in the US and at the international level, looking at some successes and hopes for the future. And then finally, discussing some opportunities for collaboration. So on that last point, given that I'm sure many of you may be working on corporate capture, so if you would like to share information on opportunities for collaboration with your organization or with others that you're aware of, if you could input that into the Zoom chat, please do so. And then we can plan on consolidating that information and sharing it as follow-up to the annual meeting. So we have three great panelists with us today who all have extensive experience and expertise on the issue of corporate capture. First, we have Jen Ahern. She's the Policy Director for Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, or CREW. We also have with us Shada Nafisi. She's Senior Program Director at Corporate Accountability. And finally, we have Dominic Renfrey, Advocacy Program Manager at the Center for Constitutional Rights. So we don't have much time, so we should probably just dive in. And I'd like to start by posing a question to all of the panelists. And I'll ask maybe Shada if you could start, and then Dom, you can respond, and then followed by Jen. That would be great. So the capture and use of corporate influence that we've seen during this pandemic isn't something that's new, but it has certainly shown a bright light on the issue. We've really seen how the well-oiled machine that corporations and industry associations have created enables them to quickly respond to and take advantage of an emergency situation to benefit industry. So in light of this, what do you see as sort of three of the most pressing methods of capture that we should be prioritizing in our work? And are there any corporate strategies or sources of influence over public bodies that are maybe flying under the radar that we should be paying more attention to? So with that, Shada, if you want to get us started, that'd be great.
Sure, my pleasure. And I'm really happy to be here with you all today. I'm sorry that I can't see all of your faces, but at least I can see the panelists, which is great. Thank you, Nicole, and I'm glad to be here with you all. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll speak maybe, in Nicole's introduction, she really covered the broad spectrum of the methods of corporate capture. And there are a lot of resources out there, a lot of groups that have developed different mappings of the types of corporate capture that we most need to look at, including ESCRnet, for example. There's a list of manifestations of corporate capture that I've always found to be helpful. And I guess for today, I mean, one of the things that the three types of corporate capture that I thought might be useful to highlight that I think get a little bit less buzz and attention are communications or PR and marketing, right? This is kind of a soft form of corporate capture that we often pay a little bit less attention to, but from our experience working on tobacco control, for example, and now on climate change, you can see a lot of the same tactics being used across industries, the kind of questioning the science, shooting the messenger, creating controversy around science that's actually quite well established, funding industry-friendly scientists, shifting the blame, invoking the freedom argument. All of those things are really common. The second one that I wanted to highlight is kind of digging in on this topic a little bit of the front groups and third-party validation, which is obviously something that industry uses across the board to lend credibility to what they're doing and to attack and undermine their critics, while avoiding brand liabilities and perceived conflicts of interest. The third that I wanted to mention, which often doesn't get a lot of screen time, is philanthropy and corporate social responsibility. So looking at the ways that corporations are using their philanthropy, using their CSR to create a positive image, to kind of gain back their social license to continue doing what they're doing. So, the way big polluters, for example, have promoted their sustainability initiatives and their green energy initiatives in order to gain access to policy spaces. And the way that they do that at a community level too, right? Funding schools, funding things of that sort to try and gain access to communities and get communities to sign on to projects. And then the last one that I wanted to mention that I think often flies under the radar, although probably not with this crew, is multi-stakeholder initiatives. This is a governance model that I'm deeply concerned about how fashionable it's become. That puts corporations, governments, and civil society all on a level playing field as if they had aligned objectives and similar accountability, that further bolsters the power and access that corporations already have to policymakers and decision makers, as if they needed an additional platform, when actually community-based groups do need that platform. And further entrenches this idea that's become pervasive throughout global society now, that corporations should have a role at the decision-making table. And I guess I want to be clear that there is always going to be a need for governments to gather information in order to, from all different sectors, to hone their governance approaches, but that's very different than giving corporations a designated seat at the table. And a couple of things that I found to be particularly troubling is where these kind of MSI initiatives actually supplant the functions of government. So they come in and they start to take over functions that governments previously took over, like provision of water or looking at crucial issues of human rights, as if corporations did not have a vested interest, when in fact we know, as the previous speakers have said, that corporations have vested economic interests that they're accountable to. And so that are often in conflict and present a conflict of interest with the goals of regulation. So I wanted to pull that out, and I think it's an increasingly troubling trend. So I just wanted to And I guess there's a lot of examples. Maybe we could go into in the question and answer of that. One of the ones that I'm troubled about is a new World Economic Forum and UN partnership. But there's a lot of different examples that we can talk about. But just wanted to leave us with that thought that as we're dealing with a problem of over-concentration of power of multinationals, that we're not unintentionally reinforcing it. And calling, I'd advocate for an external accountability approach of external regulation and accountability as being the most appropriate thing to actually counter that power imbalance that we're seeing in the world. I'll leave it there. And I know the other panelists will share a lot of wisdom to flesh out the concept.
Tom, do you want to go ahead and respond as well, and then we can do Jen?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks to ICAR. It's good to be at the annual meeting. I love it being down with you. And next year or some point soon, we'll all be doing this together again. So I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss capture too. Yeah, so I wanted to touch on some things and try and blend in a little bit of COVID, because what is 2020 without it, right? So, I mean, those who've seen any of the stuff that's come from the Center for Constitutional Rights on this will know a lot of this, so apologies, but if you have. So, and I've just put a little link here in the chat for those who kind of want to follow along and go a bit deeper. What we focus on, since it's somewhat overlooked, not largely, but somewhat overlooked, is the role of trade associations, and particularly as a poster child of that, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. For those who don't know ALEC, it's one of those corporate bill mills. It arranges twice a year closed door exclusive meetings between corporate sector and state lawmakers across the country. They brag that they have a third of all state lawmakers. That's upward of 2,000 US lawmakers on its books as members. Several hundred corporations paying several $1,000s a year to get this exclusive access. And then they sit in these executive suites in these hotels and draft legislation and then pump it out through state houses across the country. On an average, I mean, this organization has been around for 45 years. On average, they put about 1,000 state laws in through state houses across the country, and they pass about 200 of those. We'll get into it a little bit further in the conversation about some of the pretty notorious examples of that. But needless to say, trade associations are perhaps the great perpetuators of racial capitalism. And it's for that reason that we really need to keep our eyes fixated on that. We could dig a little bit more into that later. But just touching on COVID, which obviously this has an emphasis on the impact on people of color, given the types of jobs we're talking about. But ALEC has been central to the push back against government regulation under COVID, particularly in support of some of its members of large manufacturing sector. There was a letter back in March that ALEC was pushing around for endorsements from state lawmaker members of its institution. And forgive me for looking up, my brain's not good enough to keep all this information in my head, so I have to read occasionally. So they were really urging that there be no government regulation to oversee the activities of the corporate sector to manage COVID. And they say, quote, it was preferable for employers to implement best practices to protect the health of their customers and employees without micromanagement from the government. Now, it's irresponsible in the least. We saw news even just right at the beginning of COVID that some of ALEC's members who run the nation's largest slaughterhouses had not provided the right PPE, the personal protection equipment, which led to, just by March, so I don't know how many it is now, but up to 3,500 employees of these slaughterhouses, ALEC member slaughterhouses, contracting COVID, and 17 of them had died. We know that that's much more about just keeping the lights on at these factories and keeping profits flowing. And we understand the urgency for business to continue, except when you're controlling our systems of government to best protect us, you put people in the way of those decisions. So again, if you want to look a little bit more at that, there's a blog there. Yeah, also ALEC used what's that famous quote where if you leave an idea lying around at the time of crisis, it'll get picked up? Well, ALEC has been pushing for a liability shield for corporations forever. And it uses COVID to get strongly behind this corporate immunity thing that they've been trying to push. And it's now like the red line now for the Republicans in its negotiations around the packages in response to COVID. So this kind of corporate liability shield is just another example of how ALEC has really been dominating the agenda. I wanted to touch on two other things, and I apologize for taking up so much time. Another thing that needs emphasis and doesn't get enough of it, and particularly in the context of COVID, is looking at the way corporations control city administrations, particularly like municipal entities that have a huge impact on people's lives. We look at here, and I'm in New York City, we look at the City Planning Commission, for example, has always been dominated by the real estate and the financial industry. New York City politics is nothing without the real estate industry. It basically controls who gets into government and who doesn't. And so looking at the way in which city planning is dominated by these sectors is key for corporate capture activists, and beginning to think about how we can put pretty common sense conflict of interest requirements into who becomes members of those committees would be a pretty straightforward thing to do. And I'll just touch on the privatization of public security forces. We see this creeping everywhere. Center for Constitutional Rights does a lot of work in Louisiana in support of Black communities who are fighting against pipelines and the ever build out of oil and gas sector down there. And we've seen increasingly that police forces moonlight for private industry, but they don't change. So they don't change their uniform, and they use the state weapons that they issued with. But you as the general public have the firm belief that this is a public law enforcement agent operating in the interest of the public. However, you have no idea that in fact they're being paid by the industry, and they're using their various instruments to actually lock you up on behalf of the corporation. So we're getting into these really blurry spaces about the privatization of public security forces. I'll just leave that there.
Great, thanks, Dom. Jen, do you want to jump in now?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks. Really glad to be here, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. This is, I think, maybe Crew's first time at ICAR, so really excited to join you all. You know, we obviously think about corporate capture and influence from a bit of a functional perspective, in as much as we are sort of an organization that's devoted to taking action to try to push back against these things and bring accountability for abuses. And so we tend to think about things like campaign finance and lobbying and ethics, where there is an enforcement mechanism that we can try to leverage. And so that's kind of our frame for how we think about these things. But I guess I would promote that to folks to some degree in your thinking about corporate capture and the mechanisms that are used, because I think some of the more sort of vanilla flavor types of influence can go a little bit under the radar, particularly in the good government community. You know, for example, you know, I don't think U.S. lobbying laws at the federal level, at least, have really been updated in forever. You know, the House and Senate ethics rules have not been, you know, even the manuals describing ethics rules have not been updated in over a decade at this point. So, you know, there's a lot of opportunity for sort of thinking, okay, we've got that stuff taken care of, we can move on to these other areas. And, you know, I guess I would say that sort of continued vigilance on the existing areas is also, you know, pretty important, and that enforcement angle is for us a critical way to think about this. So that's one thing I would sort of put out there. And, you know, I think in particular on the financial conflict of interest laws that are sort of a part of our executive branch ethics program at the federal level. You know, those I think are particularly important as you have the sort of the techniques that Shada mentioned at the beginning of sort of intermingling public and private sector in various projects. You know, in particular, we've seen, for example, in the COVID space with several of the folks who were brought in to sort of lead the government's response there from a scientific perspective, we found that they also had financial conflicts of interest partnerships with companies that were likely to profit from this kind of work. And as we see those connections happening more, that puts even more pressure, I think, on the existing sort of conflict of interest rules to prevent some of the most troubling abuses. And if that system is not functioning, and particularly at the enforcement level, you really have sort of an open door for those partnerships to have not only a beneficial influence on sort of the business of the outsider, but also to really skew public policy in an unfortunate direction. So I would sort of pitch those as things that are worth thinking about. And I guess one last thing I would add is, I think a recent thing that I have really been thinking a lot about is the sort of situation of emergency legislation and urgent responses to major crises. And as we sort of enter into a climate crisis, or the climate crisis is here, I guess, as we sort of continue into the climate crisis timeframe, we've seen this with the PPP program that in the US was sort of the attempt to stabilize the economy in the wake of COVID. Those processes and those responses are really put together very quickly under a lot of pressure, and not always with the accountability measures built in from the beginning that would protect them. And so those really have a risk, I think, of really redoubling the effects of the existing corporate capture that's already there, because it's really relying on those existing systems and just pumping a whole lot more money and a whole lot more opportunity for influence into those systems, because it's in response to something that's really an urgent need and a crisis. And so I think that's one other way to think about how corporate capture is happening, is to really look at those immediate response kind of situations and how those are designed. We've certainly at CREW, for example, we've worked really hard to try to get the next COVID relief package to add accountability measures that really should have been in there from the beginning, and that's almost twice as hard. And so, really like looking at those particular situations with a gimlet eye, I think is also pretty important from a corporate capture perspective. So I'll stop there. Thanks, Nicole.
Hey, thanks, Holly. I think that balance between addressing some of the methods of capture that are maybe flying under the radar, like shaded the MSI issues around MSIs, I'd never really thought of from a capture perspective. So I think that, yeah, that's really interesting and important to remember as we're doing this work. But Jen, also you're called to not forget about some of these, maybe less glamorous, so to speak, issues around lobbying and government ethics is also very important to hear as well. And I know you had started to touch on this a little bit, but I'm wondering, since CCR has sort of structured its capture work from a racial justice lens, if you could maybe talk a little bit more in depth about how corporate capture is a racial justice issue and how it can be fought against from that perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So critical. I mean, one might wonder if racial capitalism is a tautology in some ways, given its history of exploiting power differences between people and populations, right? So, I mean, and we need to look at the way democracy as a vehicle has been captured, has been overtaken by those who have the power to utilize it for their own benefit. And trade associations are such a key part of that. The lobbying that ALEC does is not just kind and friendly. It's not about supporting your local neighborhood bakery. This is about reinforcing racial power inequities. And there's a lot of examples of that. I'm going to just put into the chat the link to the report that CCR and Dream Defenders and a bunch of other folks put out last year into ALEC's attacks on Black and brown communities. But I'm just going to touch on a few examples here. So, I mean, it's a heavy statement to say that ALEC is an incubator for policies that perpetuate white supremacy. There's a lot loaded in that statement, but let's just take it to some examples. ALEC was central to all of these laws I'm about to talk about. And a key example, if you want to know the history and where the Black Lives Matter and the ultimate movement for Black Lives came from, it really emanates from the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the killing of Trayvon Martin, a teenager in Florida who was walking home from a corner store with a packet of Skittles and was shot and killed by a way overzealous neighborhood watch guy. The law that allowed George Zimmerman to get off was Stand Your Ground. And Stand Your Ground was passed through Florida by the NRA initially to increase gun sales. And then was spread across the country from 2005 to 2014. Then you see voter ID, another law that ALEC has been central to passing, which is pretty clearly understood, particularly at this moment in time, to be a restriction on the ability of people of color to vote. We see right to work bills, which have stripped, we just had a fantastic panel with a lot of labor folks. I mean, absolutely stripped, continues to, across the country, the rights of unions and labor protections being gutted by right to work bills. Well, ALEC is central to the push for right to work and has been for decades. Critical infrastructure. Indigenous and indigenous allied folks who've been trying to stop the build out of oil and gas. In Louisiana, I mentioned before, North Dakota with Standing Rock, as you know. Critical infrastructure, as quoted by ALEC lawmakers, is a direct response to those folks trying to basically defend our planet. Anti-boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Palestinian advocates pushing for accountability for the activities of the Israeli government and the human rights abuses that are continuing to take place in Palestine. If you engage in the fundamentally protected right of boycott in this country and freedom of speech, well, you now find yourself facing ALEC anti-BDS bills. SB 1070, if you look at Arizona, very infamous law passed in 2010, which basically allowed Arizona state law enforcement to profile the Latinx community in benefit of ALEC members who were running private immigration detention centers. 3 strikes bills, truth in sentencing, all impacting Black and brown communities way, way more than anyone else. And then climate denial, which again, the previous panel was excellent. ALEC has been central to funding and supporting the denial of climate change. Just think on this. In 2011, ALEC wrote in a submission to the EPA that carbon dioxide is a naturally occurring, non-toxic and beneficial gas, and it poses no direct threat to public health. In order to justify regulation, the EPA is relying on an uncertain assumption that increased carbon dioxide emissions by humans are causing an unprecedented global temperature increase. And we all know that the climate crisis is affecting Black and brown communities much more than it's affecting anybody else. So you that's just a touch of it. Like, people have done a lot more reporting than that on how ALEC is central to perpetuating the profit margins of companies that make those profits off the back of Black and brown people. I think that's probably enough. I think I'll just pause there for a sec. But I just ending with the notion that ALEC is really just a poster child. It's not the whole symptom of the issue. This is just one example of basically how capture is perpetuating racial capitalism, the problem that we see in front of our eyes. Thank you.
Thanks, Dom, for laying that out so clearly and a little bit, making the horrifying impact of capture on Black and brown communities so clear. And I would also just recommend that everyone take a look at CCR's report that Dom shared. It's very good and very interesting. So we are running very short on time, so I want to quickly transition over to Shada. To Jen, to discuss a little bit about your work on policy reform at the federal level in the US, which I know you've been heavily involved in. And if you could speak a little bit to where efforts to combat corporate capture at the federal level have been and where this work might be going in the near future, particularly given potential changes in the US coming up. And also if you could explore a little bit how organizations in the corporate accountability community could collaborate or support those efforts.
Sure, great. You know, crystal ball, no problem. I'm on it. No, I'm going to go out on a limb here and make a few predictions, but mostly I think I'll just try to share, you know, where things have been and things that I think are significant that folks should keep an eye on as they may be bellwethers for where we might go in the future. You know, I think within the sort of the congressional Democratic world, you can really take a look, I think, at the first few bills that were introduced and passed in the current Congress as pretty good indications of sort of statements of intent from those folks. So in the event that, you know, we sort of end up with a Democratic trifecta next year in the U.S. federal government, I think you know, you are likely to see certainly, and a COVID response bill probably will be one of the first things that gets done. I would guess would be their first priority because it doesn't look like we're going to see that before that time at this stage. So I suspect that will be a sort of an initial priority. And, you know, as I sort of already mentioned, I think there's corporate capture issues and questions around any of that kind of work as well. So, you know, and it may be a situation where there's not a lot of time to organize around that, frankly. So, I, you know, that is one thing that I think is worth really folks keeping an eye on. You know, I think if you look at HR 1, that was the first bill that was introduced in the current Congress, and it is sort of framed as a democracy reform, piece of democracy reform legislation, and it has sort of three main elements. One is a voting element, so voting registration, just generally trying to expand the franchise more broadly. It has a campaign finance element, sort of a big title, really expanding disclosure of campaign finance information, also really trying to expand small donor matching programs in the US, you know, because we have such a sort of a First Amendment freedom of speech limitations on the kind of campaign finance regulations that we can have at this moment. You know, the small donor matching programs that allow folks to really speak with dollars that you know that they don't have in a sense, is a way to sort of really, I think, magnify the voices of folks who otherwise don't have the ability to speak with money, and also to just diversify the base of folks who are speaking in our public space. So that's I think a really big part of what's in HR 1, and frankly could still be quite controversial. And so I don't know that it's a slam dunk that will happen, but I think that's really worth folks taking a look at and thinking about how that could really impact the ability of folks you know, that you all work with to push back against corporate capture in you know, a lot of different areas. And then the third thing is an ethics title that sort of shores up a lot of federal government, particularly executive branch, but also judicial and congressional ethics, and really tries to address the enforcement issue particularly. So I think those are the key parts of the HR 1 bill, and I think you will see that as something that is likely to be a push in the next Congress, if the opportunity presents itself, or at least whenever the next opportunity presents itself, I suppose. You know, the other things I would just flag, you know, we've seen a number of bills, and some of them even have bipartisan support to address beneficial ownership issues and the particularly troubling, let's say, U.S. role in those kinds of corporate disclosure regimes around the world. And so, you know, I could see that being something that is a real opportunity for making some good progress in that space in the future. And you know, then I think I would also just flag this morning a number of sort of chairs of committees in the House introduced sort of a broad rule of law type democracy bill. And so, you know, I think you can see that also as a way to try to rein in executive power a little bit in the federal system, system and maybe bring that power back to Congress a little bit. And so I think that shift, if that happens, could also have an impact on how corporate capture is sort of addressed in the future. So that's my short spiel. I guess I'll also mention that you know, I think the executive branch itself has a major role to play in this, and so you know, in the next few months we will see, I suspect, some proposals and some statements from if particularly if Joe Biden is elected as the next president, we will see some statements on how he and his administration can take steps in that direction. So that's another thing that I'll be keeping an eye out for sure.
Great, thank you, Jen. So Shada, we've been talking a lot about sort of work to combat corporate capture within the US. So I'd like to turn to you now to talk a little bit about your experience working and campaigning on this issue internationally, including, you know, your work through international institutions and bodies and through the treaty development process around, you know, corporate accountability and BHR. And if you share any lessons you've learned through this work and any thoughts on how we can better link domestic focused work on corporate capture, both within the United States and other countries, with sort of these international campaigns.
Nice. Yeah, happily. And I think I'll end with the legal part and start with some of the other pieces. Yeah, I mean, I think just as you've said, it's really important to operate both at the local and global level. You know, there are fights that are going on daily that really matter, and we need to be paying a lot of attention to uplifting those local struggles, and we're also going for systems change. So we need to think about those precedent-setting victories, and also how do we amplify individual victories globally so that they have global reverberations. And I guess one way of sharing some lessons learned on that might be just from an example that I've been involved in. And I guess, but let me just say this: the second point that I wanted to offer to this group is around targeting global institutions and industry leaders. So this is something that corporate accountability has done since our beginning, since our first boycott of Nestle. And we found it to be just very effective as a way of not only shifting the way an individual corporation operates, but the way that whole industries operate, and actually shifting public climate and attitudes and political will on a whole spectrum, across a whole spectrum. So, you know, one of the examples of that is, for many years I ran our international water campaign, and we focused a lot on Veolia as one of the industry leaders. And we partnered with groups all over the world, from, you know, Philippines to Nigeria. And we also made those connections with groups here in the US, with groups in Flint and Pittsburgh. And there was, who were all of them facing projects where Veolia had come in and privatized water systems, and it had had a huge impact on those communities, especially communities that were already struggling to pay bills. And you know, as Dom pointed out in his presentation, we are living in a racialized capitalist regime, and so, you know, unfortunately, predictably, many of the communities that were most impacted across the globe are Black and Brown communities, are Indigenous communities, are low-income communities as well. So one of the things that we did was help to connect those communities and those struggles. And for years, we partnered with allies in Flint and Pittsburgh to expose Veolia's role in lead crises in those cities, and you know, actively campaigning and doing media outreach around that, and also exposing what they were doing globally. And actually, you know, that has had a huge impact on Veolia's ability to perpetuate harm in other communities. Even recently, there was reports from industry analysts that said that this exposure of their track record, specifically in Pittsburgh and Flint, has not only caused Veolia to lose lucrative contract renewals, but also prompted them to speculate whether the corporation should divest from the sector altogether, which was huge. And that kind of impact was only possible because it was like a globally linked fight where all those fights were made visible to the other fights and they kind of snowballed with one another. And the same thing happened, you know, we've been partnering for many years with Corporate Accountability and Public Participation Africa, CAPA, and on a fight against water privatization in Lagos, Nigeria. And similarly there, we found out that Veolia was in the running for a contract, and we were able to expose Veolia's track record in other countries, and that effectively has stopped the project ever since. So those are some of the lessons that are embedded in that, I think, are the need for a deep focus on power building and how important that is and how little attention that gets. It takes a long time to build coalitions across difference, across countries, across race, across religion, across all these different differences. And it's also incredibly powerful. So, you know, I just want to highlight that and say that one of the most important and effective things as a part of that power building that we've done is step aside and help to create a platform and support for frontline communities, especially Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, to speak for themselves on these issues, because they are the leaders and they are the ones who have the experience of what's happened and can speak most powerfully to what's happened. And even that leadership in itself is a powerful transformation. I have, like, one of my mentors here at Corporate Accountability says, organizing is equalizing power. And so we always have to think, as we're organizing, how are we equalizing power? Not just between like corporations and civil society, but within civil society and countering that racialized capitalist narrative. I'm going to wrap up here because I think I've probably gone over, but I just want to also reinforce the importance of a dedicated focus on narrative shift. There's a lot of groups who put a ton of work into us even using the common language of corporate capture, right? And so us being able to figure out what we're talking about, get a terminology together, and then project that in the world, and provide tools to grassroots communities so that they can benefit from that work that's been done, I think is critical. And then I'm over time probably, so I won't, maybe in the wrap-up question, I can share a little bit more about the binding treaty process and international law. I guess I would just say that that is another critical piece, and I will come back to that in the final question.
Great, thanks, Shada. And yeah, thanks for pulling out the importance of power building and equalization. I think that's, yeah, something that's really key to keep in mind in this work. So I'd like to go ahead and open it up to some audience questions. We don't have much time, so if you haven't already, and if you have a question for the panelists, if you could insert it into the Q&A box, that would be great. And then after that, we'll just have a few minutes for a brief wrap up from the panelists. And given that we have limited time, I'll maybe ask a couple questions at once, and then sort of ask each of you to respond to whichever ones you have responses to. So one of the questions is, you know, given the current political situation in the U.S. And you know the fact that upcoming elections in the country will play a pivotal role in sort of defining the future direction of the U.S. on key issues ranging from climate change to labor rights, et cetera. Should we as civil society groups and activists be taking into consideration at all, or just thinking about potential political costs associated with some of the policies that we're championing to combat corporate influence? And then second, and Shada, you started to touch on this already, you know, how should we be approaching the narrative and framing around corporate capture? You know, what are some of the key narratives out there, and do we need a common narrative, or is sort of having a variety of groups attacking this issue from different lenses and using different narratives to appeal to a wider variety of audiences the better approach? So maybe
if I could to start us off, is that all right, guys? Yep. Okay, cool. So much to say. Just the Shada and Jen's interventions alone have just got like, there's so much to say. I just wanted to uplift maybe in counterpoint to your first question, Nicole, like, yes, we need to focus on the election, and yes, we need to make sure the new administration doesn't do craziness, whichever administration, frankly. But I also want to flip what Jen said about like the vanilla tools that people just overlook. Like people like, oh, capture, it's like super sexy, let's do something. Public records requests, man, like simple. You want to find out what legislators are doing in about 20 states where public records request laws apply to legislators, use it. Go and ask for their tax records, their spending records, their calendars. Who are they meeting with? Who are they spending? Who are they having dinners with? Like use the things that are already there, you know? You can defeat laws in committee that you know corporations are behind at the state level. Like it doesn't take much organizing to defeat. That's not fair. It does take a lot of organizing, but less than you think to defeat a corporate law in a state level committee hearing process. They'll inject another law in a different committee that you're not looking at, but don't worry about it. You know, keep going. So I just wanted to touch on that because it's so important. We're litigating at the Center for Constitutional Rights right now because our lawmakers are violating open meetings laws, right? Like that's been on the books for a very long time. There are tools right in front of us today that we can and should use to kind of get into the fight here. So on the US politics question and political costs, it'd be interesting to tease out what you mean by political costs. I see this huge political costs of not taking on capture right now. If you want to deal with the climate change fight, you must deal with capture. You must deal with the way corporations are dictating environmental policy and economic policy, and all the others too. If you're referring to like the unintended consequences of like how, you know, some new ideas might impact folks, I think it's worth looking at. So I think what you're getting at is there's an effort, which actually I copy pasted into the chat. There's an effort by youth organizers to demand that the Biden administration doesn't have current or former executives, corporate executives, as members of its future administration. Now, I think what you're getting at is that some people are concerned that that's going to impact Black and brown lobbyists. Look, all regulations have effect on people. The question is the regulation inordinately affecting this? Is it specifically targeting a particular population? I mean, because you're putting in a ban on corporate executives from entering into administration, is that disproportionately affecting Black and brown executives? No, it's actually just a general safeguard for the democratic structures we need to allow people to dictate public policy. If it was a provision against corporate executives of a certain like background, then wow, like that's just an affront to democracy writ large. So that's not what we're talking about here though. We're talking about emerging efforts. We saw it with AOC's attempt to have a select committee on environment. She tried to stop members joining that select committee that would have accepted donations or large donations from oil and gas sector. Like this is coming now. This is really coming. If we're talking about the cutting edge of what we're all going to be pushing for around capture in a few years, hopefully together with Jen, because we'll do it together, is to kind of stop this revolving door where the corporate industry goes into government, goes back into corporate industry, goes back into government. We got to get on top of that. Huge donations from certain corporate sectors to get their lawmakers onto committees, so to pass things in favor of those industries. We got to stop that too. So I just wanted to reiterate the first point. I think that there's massive political costs for not addressing the capture we see in front of our eyes.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just jump in to say, I think also that to some extent, this is a little bit of a self-reinforcing situation, right? Because in as much as ordinary people don't have a voice in our political system, they don't have the opportunity to reward good behavior on behalf of politicians. And instead, the politicians are in a situation where the only thing that is available, you know, to them, or that they feel, is what consequences are brought on them by the corporate interests and others, you know, who have the ability to speak. And so I do think, you know, to some extent we have to think about it. First of all, I think as advocates, it's always a good idea to understand who the people that you're advocating to, what do they see as the costs to them, regardless of whether you think that's fair or not. You know, you need to know what that is and take that into account, because that's the reality of the situation. As far as how we as advocates think about what we're going to ask of them or what we're going to do, I do think that sort of requires thinking about the systemic changes and what we do and how we can sort of disrupt that cycle. because I do think that is a very problematic cycle, and it's one that's not easy to break out of in an individual space, or without making these broader systemic changes about campaign finance and lobbying and all of those things that allow those pain points to be sort of enforced on people. So yeah.
Yeah, and maybe you all covered the first one really well, so maybe I'll just speak to the second one on narrative. I think it's fine for us to have a diversity of approaches, and there's always going to be a diversity of messages targeted to different audiences. That said, I think there's also a really important role to be played for a common language and for a common call. So even having, as I said, the term corporate capture is a shift from 5 years ago, how prominent it is, for example. And that's because of the dedicated work of a number of organizations. And I guess one example of that is, talking about the climate and how important that struggle is and how transformative it could be for global societies. I think there's a really good example from that context. We, for many years, were not involved in the climate organizing at the climate talks, and then came into it because allies asked us to bring some experience from our experience with basically enshrining corporate accountability provisions in the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. Anyway, we got involved in that context, and what I've seen with a global coalition, to launch a coalition and a call to kick big polluters out of the climate talks. And from the very beginning, kick big polluters out and make them pay have kind of been central echoing demands. And I've seen over the 5 years how, I guess it's been a little bit more than that, but I've seen how that call has really become a rallying cry for global civil society in that space. I mean, last climate talks, you probably saw the coverage in Democracy Now! And a bunch of other, more mainstream media outlets about how there was a big action inside the policy talks, where civil society basically got together, started banging pots, and were like, look, governments are doing the bidding of big polluters here. They are not serving the interests of people, and they felt that they needed to take action. And there was this massive action of hundreds of groups, which included like the most conservative big green groups and frontline indigenous women, charging forward and basically calling to kick big polluters out. And that was a huge moment, I think, for of unity of the movements and of us seeing the power that we built over many, many years together as that global coalition. And I think that has shifted the dial. It's shifted the conversation in the media. It's shifted political will in terms of the governments, and it certainly has given more and more people an opening to be part of that fight. And just this last month, we finally got to the point where we have launched the next step, which is launching a liability roadmap to kind of further. It's a tool basically for social movements and for governments to see how they can hold big polluters liable. And actually, I think your colleague Nicole might have a slide on that we could share at some point before we sign off. So I think it's been very powerful to have a unified demand for all those reasons.
Great, thank you for those great responses, Jen. I think the idea of it being a cycle is an important thing to keep in mind. And Shada, I think also hearing about the campaign and that unity is sort of a nice transition to our final wrap-up question. So yeah, I just wanted to, since as we've seen throughout this panel, corporate capture is really such a widespread, long-standing problem, and it's a huge barrier to progress. And we're up against very well-resourced companies and industries with, a lot of strong incentives to capture public bodies. So just wanted to have each of you, maybe spend 1 or 2 minutes just laying out maybe some successes you've seen and what hope you see for the future. So we can end on a little bit of a positive note. Yeah, so maybe, Shada, do you want to kick us off? Sorry, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I can. I feel like I was kind of getting there on the last question. And yeah, I mean, I do see a lot of hope in the fact that more and more people are speaking a common language when it comes to really exposing the systemic problem of corporate capture, and doing that across industries. The liability roadmap that I mentioned in the last, just previously, is actually not just about big polluters. It's a roadmap for how to hold industry accountable as a whole. And I think the fact that we are crystallizing around some common strategies, you know, the big picture idea of kick them out, which has so many things underneath it, right? It has the campaign finance, the lobbying, the revolving door, and then all those kind of soft power things that I mentioned under it. And then the make them pay, which is about, oh, hey, nice timing, thank you. Which is, so this is actually the image from the website of Make Big Polluters Pay. And this is the visual for the launch of the roadmap that I just mentioned. But the fact that we have global movements starting to coalesce around common demands that would uplift all of these struggles in all of these countries, I think is very powerful and very optimistic. And I do think that the climate fight gives us a moment and an opportunity to see how much is broken in this system of racialized capitalism, and a moment to reflect on where we want to go. And I guess the urging that I would share with this group is to not hold back on your vision, to not think in incremental change. I mean, we need to have the technical people who know how to get us there step by step, but movements need to call for the radical shift. And that is our North Star. And so, and I think one of the things that I've seen, like learning from Movement for Black Lives, for example, is seeing how much putting out a radical demand can shift the public climate and dramatically shift the landscape underneath us. So I guess that's like my urging to this group today is, yes, we need the technical know-how and we need to have that backing us up. And we need to stand behind movements in their full power of frontline people saying how we need to transform the world radically. So I'm going to leave it there. I didn't get to talk about the binding treaty, but I think most people know about that. There's a process at the UN. It's a binding treaty to hold transnational corporations accountable across the board. It's like the legal arm to this vision that I'm talking about. And if you don't know about it, be so happy to talk with you about it.
Great. Dom, do you want to share your final thoughts on that question?
Yeah, sure. And Shada, I love your designer. That image is so great. Yeah, so I would say, to me, it's beyond doubt that we've been talking about it a little bit in this session, that we've been seeing narrative shift, and Shada's really good analysis of that over recent years. My feeling is we've absolutely reached a tipping point. People are just disgusted with what they see in front of their eyes, that their corporations are just really, I mean, it's obvious to a lot of people now that corporations are running how their local government operates. They're running how the federal government is operating. At least that's how they see it. I think that the phenomenon of like Bernie voters voting for Trump, to me, that is explained by just a disgust by working class people of being forgotten in politics, but also not just forgotten. They know that their voices have been replaced by the voices of corporate America, and I think they see that. So I think we've absolutely reached a tipping point. I think we're going to see an explosion in the coming administration of different types of requests for getting corporations out of government decision making. You can see it already. Representative Grijalva has got a draft letter circulating now for state lawmakers, federal congressional House representatives, being sent to Senate leadership, asking for the end of the practice of filling cabinet and sub-cabinet posts with corporate officers and lobbyists. I mean, this is no longer on the fringes. It's coming in. And so I think that gives me a lot of hope at sort of the policy level. Absolutely, at the grassroots level, I see what I was mentioning before, just basically poor folks and lower middle class people just having a gutful of it. They've had enough. And I think that that's going to change our movement dynamics. And I see people moving from how do I do capture work to doing capture work, like locally. like this, we're doing the litigation stuff around these state laws on open meetings. People are using public records requests in super crazy ways. I love it. We're seeing at the international level what Shader was talking about, and the work that Shader and others are doing to really hold the climate negotiation process very accountable. In the treaty process, just pick up on Shader's point, the International Treaty on Business Human Rights is coming. Provision 6.3, I think it is in the new draft. Just the fact that it's still in the draft after 4 years is just testament to pressure. We saw the big business lobby try to threaten a whole bunch of states a couple of years ago, saying that if they passed the treaty, they would lose billions of dollars of trade. We pushed back against that. So that provision continues. We're going to have the first piece of international human rights law that actually has a capture provision in it. You know, the things are coming, and I think it's time for everyone to join the party.
I fully agree. Jen, do you wanna?
Oh, I don't want to take us down from that. No, I guess I'll just say, you know, just a couple observations from the work we've been doing. One is that, you know, we are sort of coming at this from a very specific good government perspective. We have really seen sort of an expansion of the sort of universe of folks who are interested in those issues. You know, the Declaration for American Democracy coalition, you know, really includes a lot of different types of groups. And I think that analysis of the importance of democracy issues and having those voices really, you know, and equitably heard is really penetrating, and you're seeing those folks come together. So I think that is, you know, a great development, and you know, we'll be able to leverage that in the future for a lot. I guess I would also just say that I think you know, the Black Lives Matter movement and sort of other movements that sort of are bringing folks to a better understanding of systemic racism and the sort of systemic analyses of what's happening, I think is something that's also very helpful in sort of our broad conceptualization of what's going on and what kind of solutions we need. Because I think that is really true for corruption. It's true for corporate capture. You know, there's a whole universe of things where that kind of thinking, I think, is really helpful. And so the fact that that's happening at you know, more and more popularly, I think is really going to be a useful thing for all of us as we move forward. So those are my my bright spots.
Great. Yeah, it's always nice to end on a positive note, especially on this topic. But yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of exciting stuff happening around, you know, grassroots mobilization and you know, a deeper understanding of structural racism and how, you know, the fight against corporate capture is also a fight against white supremacy. And yeah, so that's all very exciting to hear, and we definitely have our work cut out for us. But yeah, hoping that we can keep some of that grassroots energy going to support, you know, and connect up and feed into the policy work as well. So we're over time. So I just want to quickly say thank you to our three panelists. I think, you know, the discussion was really engaging and very interesting. And yeah, with that, I'll hand it over to Jenna to lead us into break.
And thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.